Can we truly prepare for disaster? And if so, what is the best way to become disaster proof?
Well, this is funny because when the original book came out 16 years ago, I had a different answer because back then, how do people and groups behave at the worst of times? And what can we learn from that in order to do better? The arc of human behavior across all of the things we've talked about is the same 3 stages: denial, followed by deliberation, and then the decisive moment, which is where everything that has happened in those first 2 stages plays out. And you either take action or not. It's an action that's either wise in retrospect or not, right? And a lot of that depends on what's happened in the first 2 phases. So it reminds you that all the time your brain is censoring, filtering, syncing input for you. And at times of extreme duress, things can go really haywire. You're trying with the training, right, is always to keep, you know this from your military experience, you're trying to keep things in that green zone where it's helpful to you and you don't deteriorate. I'm Amanda Ripley, a journalist and the author of The Unthinkable. Welcome to Everforward Radio.
The first thing that stood out to me was the science of disaster. I've never heard science and disaster kind of put together like that. Is there a science to disaster, and what is it?
I know, isn't it the best when you discover there's a science to something that you never knew, right? Like that exists.
It's great for podcasts too. The science of anything we love. We love anything.
Right, all of a sudden it gets much more interesting. Science of food, science of paint, anything, really anything.
Our last episode was talking about the science of generosity.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, when I worked at Time Magazine, we used to automatically put something on the cover if we could say the science of, like the science of curiosity.
Wow,
you know?
wow, that's
and
useful
it would
information.
sell great. What happened was I was covering a series of disasters, sort of at first by chance for Time Magazine, and then because became like my thing and it was like my beat, which is a little depressing, but
Disaster or science?
Disasters.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so I was covering, 9/11 and different terrorist attacks and hurricanes. And then I found out about this conference that happens every year at the University of Colorado Boulder at this Hazards Research Center. And so I went to that. It's every July. And I went to that. And lo and behold, there's this whole field of study where people do nothing but study the science of disasters. And in particular, the piece of it that I just thought was captivating was the science of human behavior in disasters, right? Like, how do people and groups behave at the worst of times? And what can we learn from that in order to do better?
The human response to disaster, I feel like you could go a lot of different ways. Natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, all the way to the kind of the other end of the spectrum. You mentioned 9/11, an attack on, the home front kind of thing. But then in between there, we all experience very unique, individual, personal disasters. Yeah. And the level to which disaster really rings true for somebody, I think is, well, it's up to you. So is there a difference, scientifically speaking, in my personal response to a personal disaster, something in my life blows up, versus, oh my God, this hurricane is coming down my street?
Right. So I feel like the official response I'm supposed to say is, yes, there's a big difference. One is a collective mass casualty event. The other is individual. And in fact, most research is very siloed. So it'll be like there's a whole bunch of people who do nothing but study plane crash behavior, right? And then there's a whole bunch of people who do nothing but study fire behavior. And in fact, the behavior is the same. So I actually think there's more similarity than there is differences. So the arc of human behavior across all of the things we've talked about is the same 3 stages. Denial, like a really profound period of disbelief, followed by deliberation, which is a very social moment where people will try to look at cues from one another, discuss, even have a meeting sometimes in the World Trade Center that happened. And then the decisive moment, which is where everything that has happened in those first 2 stages plays out. And you either take action or not. It's an action that's either wise in retrospect or not, right? And a lot of that depends on what's happened in the first 2 phases. So while there are definitely differences between, getting diagnosed with cancer or getting in a plane crash, I actually don't think they're as different in the experience of the internal
like
person.
physiologically.
Yeah, physiologically, emotionally, even socially, when there's more than one person involved.
So then, is it comforting or helpful to know that the human experience during disaster, even the human response, is so predictable so that we better know how to navigate certain disasters or really kind of know what human needs are?
It was comforting to me. I mean, basically all my books, I've realized now, I don't know why it took me this long, but I'm always like running up against some just bleak reality of life on Earth and in my reporting. And then I decide there has to be another way of looking at this. And then I follow people who have been through hell and back to find out, what do they wish they'd known? What do they want the rest of us to know? And I think for me, it's been really comforting is a good word to know that, okay, there's a lot we can't predict in this world, right? Especially in a disaster. But we know that most people are going to go through those three phases, even highly trained people. It's just they move through them faster and usually more effectively. But it depends on the context. So, I was talking to an ER physician who was very effective in crises in the hospital. But when he was in a hotel room and the fire alarm went off in the middle of the night, he just went right back to bed because he didn't really have a reference point of experience or training.
Yeah, that doesn't fit my model.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. Like your brain is like a library, right? And you got a bunch of books on the shelf. And if it doesn't fit, you'll find some way to make it fit, even if it shouldn't. So he ended up, luckily, the alarms continued. He got up later. He had to escape this burning hotel. But it's sort of context dependent unless you have a lot of training and experience. Yeah.
In your work, you talk about these things called human fear circuits. What are they? Can we override them or even rewrite them?
Yeah, so we know that fear is, the research on stress, right? So when you have a little bit of stress or fear, that actually makes you better, right? It makes you like faster, more alert, more responsive, energized. It makes you stronger, literally, temporarily. We know from cortisol and stress hormones. But then there's this inflection point where it makes you worse. So too much fear, you start to notice eye-hand deterioration. You start to get tunnel vision, right? Which we hear a lot from police officers involved in shootings. They get very fixated on the weapon or the threat or even their own weapon. You can even lose hearing, which is wild. Like they fire their gun and their ears don't ring afterwards with no ear protection, which is like wild, right? So it reminds you that all the time your brain is censoring, filtering, syncing input for you. And at times of extreme duress, things can go really haywire because your brain doesn't know what to do and doesn't have a lot of training with this. So you're trying with the training, right, is always to keep, this from your military experience, you're trying to keep things in that green zone where it's helpful to you and you don't deteriorate, which, again, is easier said than done. But we definitely, to answer your question, can get better at it with even some pretty basic awareness training, like knowing where the stairs are, knowing how many rows between you and the exit on an airplane, that kind of thing.
Also, I just want to highlight, it's like I subconsciously knew we were going to talk about it. We're in the green zone right now. You're wearing green.
God.
I'm in green. I just thought green all around. This is perfect.
Yeah, there's
I love
green
it.
light.
I love it.
This is wild.
We're in the green zone right now. So that makes me think, is disaster then just a matter of perspective?
Say more.
So, or really a matter of trained or untrained. Someone that is facing an intruder in their home or their workplace to someone who hasn't had little to zero training on how to handle that situation or what to do, how to protect themselves. I'm just talking defense, not offense, versus someone who maybe, was in the military, was a cop, or taking self-defense or something like that. Is there a difference and it's just a matter of perspective?
It's definitely, there's trained and untrained, but then within that, right, there's some flip sides, right? So you might have experience with or training in a particular kind of life or death experience. And then when you experience something akin to that out in the world, you may have trauma from that experience, right? So that even though you've had that training, you've also got the trauma. So sometimes it works to your advantage and sometimes it doesn't. Let me give you an example. So Manuel Chea was a survivor of the World Trade Center on 9/11. And when I interviewed him, one of the things that struck me was how quickly, as soon as the first plane hit the tower, he got up, went to the stairs, and evacuated. That pretty much never happened in the rest of the towers.
An untrained civilian.
Yeah, untrained civilian.
In disaster response.
Exactly.
Wow.
So I couldn't.
He's like, no, one plane in my building enough for me. I'm out.
And most people didn't even know what it was, right?
Yeah.
They didn't know it was they just knew the
you're in
whole
shock.
tower just rocked. It just shifted in a way it doesn't normally. But they didn't know it was a plane. It took a long time to figure all of that out, right? So most people waited on average 6 minutes before beginning to evacuate the World Trade Center.
Now, is that normal?
So yes.
The normal average human response time, is that about 6 minutes?
Well, it depends. I know that's an annoying answer, but there were a couple of factors that were unusual. Well, not that unusual, but in Skyscrapers, the advice was to shelter in place. And that often is still the case. So the Port Authority, which ran the World Trade Center, came over the intercom in many of these places and said to stay, don't go anywhere. That turned out to be very bad advice, right? Not everybody heard that, not everybody followed that, but there were different things that slowed people down extra. But in general, the rule we can all count on is that people will take longer to evacuate than you expect. So even once they got into the stairwells, people took about a minute per floor to evacuate, which was twice as long as safety engineers had predicted. And remember, those towers were half full. So imagine if they'd been full, right? So because it was an election day in New York and different things, they were not full. So that was a huge shock for engineers and safety experts because that changes the whole calculus, right? I mean, if you're on the 30th floor, that's 30 minutes, and you're not, we tend to not think vertically, right? We think horizontally. Like if I were that same distance at the end of a building with no exits.
So how far could I run? How far could I walk?
I would be thinking.
How many floors down do I need to go?
Yeah. So that's why getting in the stairwell and going down. And this leads back to Manuel. So basically, he had been in a house fire as a little kid. And so he knew that things can go bad really quickly.
So he immediately had that past lived experience step in.
And he had also figured out where the stairs were, which was super important. And many, many people in the Trade Center did not know where the stairwells were. They didn't know that they were complicated. Like there was like a transfer hallway for some of them. Anyway, because he had that knowledge and that experience, that was very helpful for him. But you could imagine it going the other way, right? Depending on his own personality and experiences and everything that had happened since. So it's a little tricky.
Do you think are the delays in human response to disaster more just pure that moment physiological response, or is it kind of our nature to want to see what's going on? We can't look away from a train wreck kind of thing.
Right, like curiosity and intrigue.
Right,
yeah, I think it's all the things. And that I'm glad you said that because that leads us to the second phase, which is deliberation, right? So the funny thing about disasters, everyone I've covered, whether they're hurricanes, tsunami, floods, mass shootings, people get weirdly social. Like
what do you mean by that?
They want to talk to each other. They want to stay in groups. They will stay in groups, even at great jeopardy to themselves.
Do you think they want to help? Is that because they want to help others, or is it just, I need to know I'm not going through this alone?
I think it's evolutionary. Like basically there's safety in numbers. So the same is true with chimpanzees. Like when they're under threat, they will form groups and help each other. So this is a little counterintuitive, right? Because I think at least I always thought from movies and whatever that people would, lose their minds and it would be like every man for himself. And
people get trampled.
Yeah, people get trampled. And
push people out of the way.
Exactly.
Or people in a body of water, like pushing others down so that you can get it to the top.
Right. And I mean, sometimes those antisocial things do happen and we can talk about when that happens, but it's extremely rare. And it's kind of like important because if you think about all emergency planning and homeland security and all the kind of work and policy that is done to protect people, often those experts assume that people are going to misbehave, that they're going to be antisocial, that they're going to panic, right? Just like, the movies.
Yeah, you have to kind of plan for worst case scenario. It's a disaster.
Right. But think about if you're assuming that people are going to be antisocial, and in fact, people are very social, think about what that means for what you're going to tell them, how honest you're going to be with them, how much you're going to count on them, right? There's a way in which our assumption that that disasters bring out the worst in us actually has killed many, many people because it leads people in charge to withhold information.
Oh, right. I see.
Yeah, because they don't trust the public, right? Wow. They think we're going to freak out. And so they better not tell us about, whatever threat we're facing. They better not be too, that's why a lot of times you'll see these stupid signs that are like, in case of emergency, be calm and await further direction. It's like, because there's an assumption in there that I'm going to just lose my mind and start screaming hysterically, which again is not what happens. Weirdly, people are typically much nicer in a disaster than they are at rush hour.
This is so opposite of anything that in movies or, what you kind of see or hear on the news. So then is this just a radical flipping on its head of what actually happens to the human experience during disasters and what we're being told or shown?
Absolutely. It's 100% predictable and infuriating because once you start seeing it, you'll see it over and over again. There was just a Japan Airlines crash this year, early January 2024. And, pretty scary situation, planes on fire. So most plane crashes are actually survivable, which is also a shock. But everything depends on what you do when the plane's on the ground and on fire, because you have very little time before that smoke is really toxic. So in this case, the flight attendants did a great job. They figured out which exits were safe, and they opened those exits.
Not during a disaster. Leave the carry-on, everybody. Leave the overhead.
Yeah, let alone on one of those slides, which I got to do some of that training with flight attendants for the book. And you can't do it with a rolling suitcase becomes a missile, on a slide. It's quite steep. So anyway, they didn't bring their stuff. They got off. They were safe. Plane blew up. Everyone was okay. And afterwards, there was 2,000 news stories about the miracle, and then inevitably some journalist will claim that it's cultural. It's the Japanese way, to be quiet and calm and obedient, and so insulting. And the same happened in London after the 7/7 transit bombings. There was this whole storyline about how the Brits stiff upper lip. It happens every time there's a disaster. New Yorkers, remember when that plane landed in Sullenberger landed a plane in the Hudson?
The Tom Hanks movie. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And same, people are like, New Yorkers. So anyway, no.
Whatever the prevailing narrative is at the time, or the geographical narrative.
Yeah, it's actually just humans. Humans, if given direct, assertive guidance in an emergency, will tend to be quite amenable and collegial, more so than normal. And it's really helpful to understand that.
Is this all kind of what we're just talking about now? Is this under the crowd dynamics part of your work?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, because but it comes out in a million ways. I mean, it comes out in, officials not leveling with the public in the pandemic. It comes out in, conversations about when to evacuate for a hurricane, this fear that people are gonna misbehave and do terrible things to each other. That might be true in regular times. Some percentage of people are going to misbehave, right? I'm not naive, but the research is very clear that in non-regular times, when shit's hitting the fan, people tend, at least for a while, not forever, but for a while, people tend to show each other a lot of decency and grace, almost to a fault. So in the 9/11 evacuation of the Trade Center, one of the problems and one of the reasons it was so slow is that each floor, as they descended, would let in the floor below them into the stairwell. No, after you, that kind of thing, and that's really nice and polite, but actually it means...
So it just bottlenecked.
Yeah, and the people who have the farthest to go now are taking even longer to get out because they're letting everyone else go in front of them.
A disaster is a disaster, and I think the argument can be made objectively that they're fearful. A lot of us get afraid whenever a disaster is coming or is happening, But do you think fear happens because our knowledge of situation grows, or is there something more biochemical happening despite our level of awareness to that threat?
Oh, that's interesting. Right. Because it totally depends on the story in your head, right? Like you can be not afraid at all when you should be afraid.
Right. Yeah. I case in point, myself and a lot of other, I think, first responders and military can relate.
Yeah.
In just day to day, very stressful situations, not a full blown disaster. I have my own personal response, and other people around me are freaking their shit.
Right.
And it's just like, we kind of have a different narrative in our head, or our exposure to and response to fear and that threat escalation potential.
Totally.
So I feel like is that the case, or is that just my kind of experience?
Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum. You're right. Yeah, there's a spectrum of reactivity and responsiveness to fear. So if you look at particularly people who make it through special forces selection, the research on that is totally fascinating because it does show that I'd actually be curious to hear what you think of this. So there's definitely a small percentage of people who just remain eerily calm, right? And you've probably seen this. And it's hard to predict it's not always who you think it's going to be, right? Like sometimes it's like people who seem calm normally are not calm in a life or death situation. But there was this really interesting research that was done where a psychologist tried to predict who was going to be really eerily calm and get through that selection process. And it turned out that you could predict it with like 90% accuracy.
No way.
Yeah.
90%.
Yeah. And you know how you predicted it?
How?
By asking just a couple questions before the people went in through the selection gauntlet.
What were the questions?
The questions were basically about, do you disassociate? Like, have you in the past week or so had a moment where you sort of saw yourself from a distance? Now this is really complicated, right? Because
non-psychedelic use aside.
Exactly right. Yeah, naturally.
By choice.
Yeah, and this is complicated because, and it almost makes me nervous to talk about because dissociation can be really dangerous and a sign of deep trauma that needs to be dealt with, right?
Yeah, it could really be frozen. Fight, flight, fear, freeze kind of thing. Yeah.
And it could be like often it'll happen to people who've been, molested as kids. It's a coping mechanism that's understandable, all right, in the moment to kind of see it's almost like you're looking down on yourself, you're out of body, right? So that is one thing. But then it does seem like there are these small number of people who do that to a much lower level all the time. And when you test their saliva, the level of cortisol dissipates really quickly for them.
No way.
Yeah. So they're literally chemically different.
Now, is that by choice? Like someone who chooses, I'm consciously separating myself from this stressful situation, and then that triggers the biochemical response?
I don't think so.
Or it's just kind of a innate?
It's either an innate and or learned adaptation from like your whole life, right? So it's probably a combination. Usually it's both, right? So it's probably a combination, and it's not easy to control. The only bridge, and you know this, between the involuntary fear response and your conscious choice is the breath. So that's all we've got, really.
It's the only thing you can disrupt nervous
The only
systems.
way to talk to your nervous system on like without drugs or other things, right? So that's why, they call it different things, but tactical breathing, right? Or combat breathing, that is the same as what you do in yoga or other things. It's, so
we call it a tactical pause.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And that's why it's so important to train for that. And that's something I think everybody should do all the time. My son is learning to drive. And I was telling him how you want to seize those moments to practice. I was teaching him box breathing, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, down for 4, hold for 4, right?
Great mom. This is great. All right, I love it.
He's probably like, oh my God, really? This again? But just get that to an automatic place so that anytime you feel that stress response, you do that without thinking. And then that will get you back into that green zone, right? But everybody could do that and should do that, I think.
I wonder then have you seen this, or what do you think about, is the opposite true? Or can we kind of reverse engineer that? Could we look at somebody, could we measure cortisol in various states, in a fasted state, in a stressful state, and kind of based on those results go, hey, you are going to be better suited for proper response in disaster?
Yeah, really? We could. Yeah. And interestingly, that researcher that I mentioned, he told the military, I think it was the Army, I'm trying to remember if it was the Rangers or what it was, but he said,
Go Army.
Yeah, he said, look, you can maybe skip this whole like brutal selection process, which is quite dangerous, and just do this like short multiple choice question. And they were like, no, thank you.
And run a cortisol test.
Yeah, and run a cortisol test. Yep. But they said, there's a kind of, value around meritocracy and giving everyone a chance and proving, so, and it's not 100% accurate, right? So, to be fair, it did seem like maybe that's not the way to go, but it does feel like it would be helpful data.
Very, but also, kind of getting a little sidebar here, I feel like that would kind of take away from the potential of people being able to rise to the occasion.
Yeah.
And especially in special forces selection or any kind of, tight-knit unit that has to be created. There's a certain level of predictors and even tests that you can administer to filter down probability of who's going to make it and who's not. But you talk to any special forces operator or SEAL, at the end of the day, it's because we all went through the same stuff.
Right, and you'd be losing that experience.
And it doesn't matter,
right?
If your cortisol is higher in your spit versus mine, I know what you're capable of because we've proven it to each other.
Right, so that you're saying that actual gauntlet, that experience is part of the training. Like that's part of the bonding, the connection, the trust, the pride, the sense of identity and so belonging. Yeah, those things are super powerful. Just as powerful as cortisol, right? So, it doesn't necessarily change the process for the military, but it's really interesting to think about. And I know for myself, there are some situations where I'm really good. Like I can push through that denial phase really fast, and other situations where I'm terrible. Like the pandemic, I was in full-blown denial about that thing for a long time in the beginning. Like I just kept thinking, this is fine, this is gonna be over. Like I just did not. And throughout the whole thing, I would find myself either underreacting or overreacting, know?
To your point, or to your, I can't talk today, excuse me, to your point earlier, do you think that's because a lot of what we were told was, hey, keep calm. We were kind of fed this level of like downplaying the situation, in my opinion. So do you feel like maybe, however your interpretation of the pandemic was, the information you were getting, was that influencing your level of downplaying?
For sure. And there's a lot that I write about in this updated version of the book about what went wrong with the communication. But the consistent thread is the same thing we talked about, where the public was underestimated again and again and again. So lots of examples of that and lots of counterexamples, times where people in charge did trust the public and did level with the public, but it was so chaotic and inconsistent that it was really hard, right, to know whom to trust. So then you end up relying on your intuition, which is kind of worthless in a situation that you've never been in before, right?
In your research or maybe personal experience, in what way were we most underestimated as the U.S. population during the pandemic?
So it did vary by state. So some states did a lot better. And I think, I remember there being a kind of almost like a mockery of people who were disobeying some of the mandates, like a kind of disrespect. Like I remember early on when there were kids at spring break, right, at the beaches, remember that? And they'd be like on CNN and it'd be like, look at this, and it's like not understanding human behavior to think that that's helpful, right? It's like people who really work in disaster communication, and I talk about Dennis Milletti, who was my go-to source for years, who had spent his career studying how to communicate and warn the public. What they tell you is you have got to listen to people. Ask them why they're going to spring break. Ask them what their assumptions are. Ask them what they need. And it's different messages.
To use as data points, not critique, right?
Right. So that you can then shape and target your message, because there's different messages for different people, right? But it doesn't mean that they're, selfish or mean or clueless or idiots. So all that kind of thing is super unhelpful, and got very mixed up in our own political polarization, right? So, Trump said one thing, teachers unions said the opposite. And then you just get into this crazy back and forth where, neither side is really adapting based on the evidence.
Can we truly prepare for disaster? And if so, what is the best way to become disaster proof?
Well, this is funny because when the original book came out 16 years ago, I had a different answer, because back then while a lot of Americans lived in places at risk of disasters, most of us hadn't experienced them, and I didn't think most of us would. Since then...
Which most people won't, right?
Well, it depends how you define it, right? So since then, 90% of U.S. counties have had a federally declared disaster. So 90% of the population goes along with that. 90% of Americans have lived in or near a disaster since from 2011 to now, right?
That's pretty astounding.
Yeah, because the frequency and cost of disasters has like skyrocketed. So there's an increase in disasters, particularly floods, hurricanes, fires, heat waves. Those are kind of the big ones. And then, of course, the pandemic, right? So that is a disaster. It's a biological disaster. It's slower. And I mean, it just goes on in ways that those other disasters don't. But it very much the same phases of human behavior respond.
Yeah, that was a 3-year disaster, right?
Yeah, and there was denial, and there was deliberation, and and then back, and it's like, yeah. So in that sense, because about half of Americans know someone who died in the pandemic from COVID, and because approximately 1.3 to 1.4 million additional people died between 2020 and 2023 in the U.S., beyond what we would expect in normal times, it was clearly a disaster. And in that sense, we are all disaster survivors, depending on how you want to define it. And we have some experience with that struggle to figure out where is true north, who do I trust, how long do I deliberate, when am I in denial and when am I not, right? And so in that sense, we all have a lot of experience. And, unfortunately, some of that's going to get worse. But there's good news, which is also, you remember how I said the number and cost of disasters has skyrocketed? It's up like 5-fold over the past 50 years. It's crazy if you look at the chart. I have a chart in the book that's like insane. Different reasons. A lot of it's because we've moved to places that are just more dangerous, like cities on the coast, basically. So, and the way we've developed those places has made it much easier for fire and floods to spread.
So when you say disaster, you're predominantly talking about natural disasters?
Well, that's a controversial phrase, believe it or not. Like, is it natural? Because you could have like Hurricane Katrina. There had been worse hurricanes before that killed very few people. It's not just the storm and like Mother Nature. It's like how we are developing and building around it. Another analogy would be earthquakes, right? You could have an earthquake that hits in Turkey and kills thousands and thousands of people.
We just had one.
We just
did,
last year or something? Exactly. Yeah, so we had some terrible ones there. And then you can have the exact same earthquake from like a strength magnitude point of view that occurs in Los Angeles and kills no one. And that's entirely because of building codes, right? So because there are building codes in place, not perfect, but better, then the buildings can withstand that shock.
I sat with one. When I first moved to LA, I was in a high-rise, a brand new high-rise building downtown LA. And we experienced, I think it was like a 7-point something. Oh, that's a big one. Like high 6, low 7. Very significant. And sitting in my living room, and the whole building just doing this.
How tall was the building?
I was on the 14th floor. The building was like 30-some.
Ooh.
So it was big, but just to see it and to go through, I mean, I can only imagine not being in a building that was not structurally engineered to support, literally being on ball bearings and being able to, to move and sway like that. Wow. I mean, it was still a pretty gnarly experience. Yeah. But on top of that, just being someone who was not prepared, didn't, if you're new to the city, new to the area, what could happen, also being in a building that wasn't prepared for that. Yeah, the same experience, put it somewhere else, is going to be drastically different. Yeah.
So Chase, did you know what was happening? Do you remember what your thought process?
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, okay.
You knew what it was.
Yeah, my wife and dog were freaking their shit, running around, going crazy, even kind of looking out and seeing people, respond in different ways. I go back to my military training. Definitely now, I've been out for like 10, 11, 12 years now. It's becoming more and more apparent how kind of, I almost say like disaster proof, but just training in catastrophe has prepared me for the real world, because it's just so much more accepting of what is happening and immediately going to, okay, what can I do?
Right. And not getting stuck in oh my God, I can't believe
this is happening. Right. It is what it is. Right. What can I do?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That came up again and again when I interviewed different survivors. Like people, and this is just anecdotal, but people who had military training seem to be able to get there quicker. Like to get to, okay, I need a checklist in my head. I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and spend lose less time. Let's put it that way.
Right, exactly. Which can literally save your life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Kind of getting towards the end here, I want to be mindful of your time. Is there a best way to prepare for a disaster? And then also on the other side of it, what is the best way to transition out of, especially in that kind of fear state, out of a disaster state?
Yeah. So in this version of the book, I included an appendix that like walks you through like steps you can take like right now. And some of that is looking at your own strengths and weaknesses, right? Which are going to be different for different people, but assessing, how well do you know your neighbors? Because like it or not,
never would have thought about that.
Yeah,
Wow.
those are the people who are going to save you in a disaster and vice versa. It's your neighbors, your coworkers, and strangers on the train. Always. Because first responders can't get there in time, unfortunately, right? So over and over again, it's regular people who save the most lives in every disaster. And so the book is really their story, like the story of regular people under extreme duress. And they will do incredibly creative, generous, brave things. But it helps, right, if they have some prior relationship and also knowledge about the threats and risks wherever you live. So for you, obviously, earthquakes, big one, right? For most people, it's going to be flood, lightning, fire, heat wave. Those are the things that are most likely. We know the odds of another equally deadly pandemic happening in 50 years, and the next 50 years are about 50-50. So unfortunately, pandemic.
Cool. I'll get 2 in one lifetime. Cool. All right.
Yeah. So the more, like for me, the emergency is for that is like rebuilding trust. Like we have got to have more trust, not just in institutions and the media, but like in each other.
That's a great little reinforcement to this. Again, another military kind of mindset philosophy that stuck with me is, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready.
Oh yeah.
And that means that means a lot of different things, whether it's having a go bag or a first aid kit or just, an evacuation plan. But I think it's important to note what you just said, part of that staying ready so you don't have to get ready is it's outside of your home. It's outside of just the actual practical things that you can grab or use. It's who can you rely on? Who can you communicate with? And what is that relationship? What does that communication need to be?
Right. And do you know who's elderly in your neighborhood? Who needs help? Who has a generator? Who's an ER nurse? Like those are kind of like assets that you want to know about. And so, I mean, the bottom line, if you take nothing else from this for people who are listening, is the health of a community after a disaster has much more to do with the health of a community before a disaster than it does with the actual disaster. So how can you, in your own world, help make your community stronger, right? Whether it's, at your church or with your soccer team or your neighbors at a block party, all of those things really, really matter, not just to the response, but to the recovery.
Cool. My next dinner event at the house, I'm going to give everybody, hey, here's your go bag.
There you go.
Here's your community evacuation plan.
Crank phone charger. Those are my favorite. Those are my favorite.
I want to ask one more question because I think it's so pertinent still to, today. And I know it's probably a new addition to your work before we wrap up here. And that's the role of social media. The role of social media in distrust and disaster response. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so when I wrote the book, social media was really not a thing. So that was one of the many things that really needed to get updated. And I think one of the challenges with the way we've designed social media platforms, not all of them, but many of them, right, is that they have deteriorated trust in a lot of ways, right? So that trust, if that's kind of like the water that we need in a disaster, right, you want to make sure that you're building algorithms to enforce that, right? To sort of boost that trust.
But who's going to do that?
Well,
that doesn't sell. That's not
exactly,
sexy. That doesn't get clicks.
Yeah. I mean, but if you think about it, there are some online like climates that are actually pretty pro-social, right? Like if you need to like fix your toilet flapper, oh my God, there's like 4 million people who are happy to help you in a free video and give you advice in the comments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, true. Very true.
And so there is like different ways that you can set norms and create a culture of healthy conflict. And that's like my last book is about conflict. So I'm kind of like fixated on that, but it's very related to this trust piece. You could right now flip a switch and have an algorithm on X or YouTube that boosts content that builds trust and is like pro-social. I mean, that all exists. It's just a choice not to. And I actually think, maybe I'm naive, that we will get there, that people are going to burn out on this. And it's just like, just like they've burned out on the way traditional journalism is done, and they're actively avoiding it, unfortunately, right? My business. So you have to change what we're offering people. And so I think offering people something that actually builds up their connection and their sense of belonging is way more powerful.
My last question before my last question is, in studying fear and disaster, did this make you a more fearful person, or do you feel like your ability to respond to disaster and manage fear has become more resilient?
I'll tell you what made me more fearful was covering disasters the way media normally covers them. Just doing it over and over again, having to listen to story after story of tragedy and heartbreak, and then write stories about blame and, who's at fault. And those are all important stories, but it felt like not enough, right? Like there has to be more. And so then going out and talking to people who have been through disasters or who study disasters made me a lot less scared, actually. It made me much more hopeful about other people in disasters.
Why do you think that is?
I think because the reality is often not as bad, or it's different bad, right, than what we expect. And
we suffer far more in our imagination than in reality.
Yeah. And the biggest problem is that people in charge don't trust us, and we don't trust them, right? So that is where things get really ugly. But the behavior on the ground, especially if you have a little bit of awareness and knowledge about the risks you face in the places you live in, can actually be amazing, like very different from normal life.
Having more knowledge about disasters and understanding how to navigate them, absolutely, I think is going to help me know how to move forward in those situations. So my last question for you is ever forward. Those two words, what do they mean to you?
For me, ever forward means learning from people who have been through hell and back again in all different contexts, over and over and over again. So in the next crisis we face as a country or as a civilization, the first question should be, who's been through this before and what do they know? For me, that's really been very helpful.
I love that answer. That's so good.
Oh, good.
Well, where can my audience go to connect with you, learn more about your work and the upcoming book?
I'm on Instagram at Amanda Ripley Writer. Let me say that again. I'm on Instagram at Ripley Writer, and I'm also at amandaripley.com. And you can find some resources and cool tools for dealing with conflict and rebuilding trust at thegoodconflict.com.
Great. Well, I'm going to go start building my battle bunker and become a prepper and all the things.
Excellent.
And get my crank radio.
Yes.
Amanda, this was so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chase. It's good to be here.
Man, I would love to have, I got to come back and dive deeper. And this was so much fun.
Yeah. If you get a chance to
and
take
it spawns
a look,
like a whole lot of
think.
new questions and stuff.
Oh,
That's
good.
so good.